Welcome, kindred spirits, to a place of positivity, passion, and purpose. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here as we tackle Dutch conquest of the Banda Islands. The Dutch conquest of the Banda Islands, also referred to as the Banda genocide, was a process of military conquest from 1609 to 1621 by the Dutch East India Company of the Banda Islands. The Dutch, having enforced a monopoly on the highly lucrative nutmeg production from the islands, were impatient with Bandanese resistance to Dutch demands that the Bandanese sell only to them. Negotiations collapsed after Bandanese village elders deceived and murdered the Dutch representative Pieter Willemsz Verhoeff. Under the command of Jan Pieterszoon Coen, the Dutch resorted to a forcible conquest of the islands, which became severely depopulated as a result of Coen's massacres, forced deportations, and the resulting starvation and disease. The Dutch East India Company, which was founded in 1602 as an amalgamation of 12, had extensive financial interests in maritime Southeast Asia, the source of highly profitable spices, which were in high demand in Europe. A Dutch expedition had already made contact with the islands in 1599, signing several contracts with Bandanese chiefs. The profitability of the spices was heightened by the fact that they grew nowhere else on earth, making them extremely valuable to whoever controlled them. As the Dutch attempted to form a monopoly over the spices and forbid the Bandanese from selling to any other group, they resisted, and the Dutch decided to conquer the islands by force. With the aid of Japanese mercenaries, the Dutch launched several military expeditions against the Bandanese. The conquest culminated in the Banda massacre, which saw 2,800 Bandanese killed and 1,700 enslaved by the Dutch. Along with starvation and constant fighting, the Bandanese felt they could not continue to resist the Dutch and negotiated a surrender in 1621. Jan Pieterszoon Coen, the official in charge of the fighting, expelled the remaining 1,000 Bandanese to Batavia. With the Bandanese resistance ended, the Dutch secured their valuable monopoly on the spice trade. Turning our focus to background, let's explore its key elements. The first Dutch expedition to explore the Banda Islands, as well as Banten, Ternate and Ambon, was launched on 1 May 1598. A fleet commanded by Jacob Corneliszoon van Nick, Jacob van Heemskerk and Wybrand van Warwick set sail and made contact with the inhabitants of the Banda Islands in 1599. Heemskerk signed several contracts with Bandanese chieftains and constructed a spice trading outpost. The volcanic Banda Islands were found to be unique due to the availability of nutmeg and mace, which grew nowhere else in the world and therefore had extreme commercial value. In this section, we'll be peeling back the layers of Battle of Bandanera to reveal its true essence. The Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch acronym, VOC, was founded on 20 March 1602 as a merger of the 12, with the exclusive right to all Dutch navigation and trade in Asia and the East Indies, including the right to conclude treaties, declare and wage war, and establish fortresses and trading posts. In early April 1609, a Dutch fleet commanded by Pieter Willemsz Verhoeff arrived at Bandanera and wanted to force the establishment of a fortress. The Bandanese preferred free trade so that they could play off the various European countries' merchants against each other and sell their products to the highest bidder. However, the Dutch sought to establish a monopoly on the spice trade so that the Bandanese could sell their products only to the Dutch. Negotiations were arduous, and, at a certain point in late May 1609, the chieftains lured Verhoeff and 2 other commanders who had left their fleet to negotiate on the beach, into the woods into an ambush and killed them. Their guard was also massacred by the Bandanese, so that a total of 46 Dutchmen were killed. In retaliation, the Dutch soldiers plundered several Bandanese villages and destroyed their boats. In August, a peace favourable to the Dutch was signed. The Bandanese recognized Dutch authority and monopoly on the spice trade. That same year, Fort Nassau was built on Bandanera to control the nutmeg trade. In the upcoming section, we'll be shining a light on expeditions against Lonta, Run, and I. Piet Hein replaced Verhoeff as the fleet's commander. Having finished constructing Fort Nassau, the fleet sailed north to Ternate, whose sultan allowed the Dutch to rebuild an old damaged Malay fortress that was renamed Fort Orange in 1609. This became the de facto capital of the Dutch East India Company until Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, was founded on Java in 1619. The Dutch got involved in a brief war between Ternate and the nearby island kingdom of Tidor. In March 1610, Hein arrived on Ambon and, after long but ultimately successful trade negotiations on a large clove purchase with the Ambons from March to November 1610, he conducted two punitive military expeditions in early 1611 against the Bandanese Isles of Lonta, also known as Lonta or Banda Besar and Pulo Run. Thereafter, he was tasked to build Fort Belgica on Banda Nera, which became the third Dutch fortress on the Banda Islands. A 1610 Dutch attack on the island of Ai, however, proved to be a failure. Brace yourself for an enlightening exploration of conquest of Ai as we dive into its profound implications. The Bandanese resented the violently imposed obligation to trade exclusively with the Dutch. They violated their treaty with the Dutch by trading with the English, who offered better prices, and Malay, Javanese and Massacres traders who sold the spices on to the Portuguese. Unwilling to accept this obstacle to their commercial interests any longer, the Vox governing body, Heeren XVI, concluded by 1614 that it was necessary to conquer the entire Bandanese archipelago, even if it meant the destruction of the native population and a heavy burden on the company's finances. To that end, Governor-General Gerard Reince took an army to Banda Nera on 21 March 1615, and then launched a punitive expedition against the island of Ai or Pulo Ai on 14 May 1615. The natives' fortresses were initially successfully attacked, but the Dutch troops resorted to plundering too early. The English, who had retreated to Run, regrouped and launched a surprise counterattack that same night, in which they managed to kill 200 Dutchmen. Reince decided to withdraw from Ai, intending to conquer the island later and first preventing the English from obtaining clove at Ambon, but he died of illness in December 1615. Meanwhile, the Bandanese besieged the English for protection against possible Dutch retaliation, sending an emissary to the English factory at Banton with a letter, which included the following statements. Therefore we all desire to come to an agreement with the King of England, because know the Hollanders do practice by all means possible to conquer our country and destroy our religion, by reason whereof all of us of the islands of Banda do utterly hate the sight of these Hollanders, sons of whores, because they exceed in lying and villainy, and desire to overcome all men's country by treachery, that if so be the King of England out of his love towards us will have a care of our country and religion, and will help us with artillery power and shot, and help us recover the castle of Nera, whereby we may be able to make war with the Hollanders. By God's help all the spices at our land shall yield, we will sell only to the King of England. In April 1616, Jan Pieterszoon Coen took 263 men with him and, against fierce resistance, was able to conquer Ai. Coen decided to make an example of the island, killing any native who put up resistance, while another 400 natives, amongst whom were many women and children, drowned while trying to flee to the nearby English-controlled island of Run in the west. This forced the Orang Kaya on the other Banda Islands once more to sign contracts favorable to the Dutch. Coen ordered the construction of Fort de Rake, named Fort Revenge by the English on Ai, to emphasize the brutal vengeance the Bandanese should expect to suffer if they broke trade deals with the Dutch. However, even these actions proved to be insufficient to allow the Dutch to form a monopoly over the nutmeg and mace trade. Although initially intimidated, the Lontas soon resumed trading with former trade partners, including the English, who had established themselves on the islands of Run and Nalika. The time has come to unravel the secrets behind Siege of Run and gain a deeper understanding. On 25 December 1616, English merchant adventurer Nathaniel Kirthorpe landed on the island of Run with 39 men and constructed a fortress on it. He persuaded the inhabitants to sign a contract in which they undertook to accept King James I as the sovereign of their island and to provide the English with nutmeg. The Dutch proceeded to lay siege to the English fortress, which with native assistance managed to resist them for over 4 years, with the fortress finally falling to the Dutch after Cothorpe was killed in a skirmish, causing the English to abandon the island. Finally in possession of Run, the Dutch proceeded to kill or enslave all adult men, exile the women and children, and chop down every nutmeg tree on the island to make it useless should the English try to re-establish trade on the island. The Dutch allowed some cattle to roam free on Run, in order to provide food for the other islands. It was not until 1638 that the English tried to visit Run again, after which Dutch officials annually visited the island to check if they had secretly re-established themselves until the English formally renounced all claims to the Banda Islands in 1667. Let's zoom in on Anglo-Dutch conflicts and understand its implications. While the siege of Run was ongoing, tensions between the Dutch East India Company and the English East India Company rose and erupted in open naval warfare in 1618. The new VOC Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Coen wrote a letter, now known as the Appeal of Coen, to the Heeren XBII on 29 September 1618, requesting more soldiers, money, ships and other necessities in order to wage war against both the Bandanese and the English. Being a pious Calvinist, he tried to persuade his superiors that it would be a good investment they would not regret, because the Christian God would support them and bring victory, despite earlier setbacks. Despair not, spare not your enemies. There is nothing in the world that can hinder or harm us, for God is with us. And do not draw a conclusion from the preceding failures, because there, in the Indies, something grand can be accomplished. The Dutch managed to seize 11 English ships, some of which were carrying cargoes of silver, while the English captured only 1 Dutch ship. However, this unofficial war was inopportune to the governments back in Europe, who in 1619 concluded peace and a treaty of defence between the Dutch Republic and England, as they prioritized a Protestant alliance against Catholic Spain and Portugal with the end of the 12 years truce nearing. The Heeren XVII ordered Coen to cease hostilities and cooperate with the English, who would receive 1/3 of all spices from the Spice Islands and the Dutch the other 2/3. Coen was furious with the instructions when he received them, as he sought to expel the English from the entire region to form a monopoly on the spice trade, as he wrote to his superiors in a letter. I admit that the actions of the master are of no concern of the servant, but under correction your honours have been too hasty. The English owe you a debt of gratitude, because after they have worked themselves out of the Indies, your lordships put them right back again. It is incomprehensible that the English should be allowed 1/3 of the cloves, nutmegs and mace, for they cannot lay claim to a single grain of sand in the Moluccas, Amboina or Banda. Brace yourselves for the next chapter, where we'll be dissecting Banda massacre. Judging that Bandan's resistance to Dutch attempts to establish their commercial supremacy in the archipelago had to be crushed once and for all, Coen wrote a letter to the Heeren XBII on 26 October 1620, stating, to adequately deal with this matter, it is necessary to once again subjugate Banda and populate it with other people. As proposed, the Heeren XVII instructed him to subjugate the Bandanese and drive their leaders out of the land. Let's now shift our focus to invasion and explore the ways in which it shapes our perspective. The Dutch fleet from Batavia sailed at the end of 1620. It first arrived at Ambon, where it joined with reinforcements in the form of soldiers and ships before continuing to Banda. The fleet consisted of 19 ships, 1,655 Dutch soldiers and 286 Japanese mercenaries, and was personally led by Coen himself. On 21 February 1621, the fleet arrived in Fort Nassau, where it was reinforced by the fort's 250-strong garrison and 36 native ships. After unsuccessfully trying to recruit Englishmen from the nearby Run and Coen began sending scouts to the coastline of Lonta, the main Bandanese island. The reconnaissance took 2 days, during which some boats came under cannon fire from the Bandanese defenders. The scouts found fortified positions along the southern coast and in the hills and failed to find a possible beachhead. On 7 March, a Dutch probing party landed on the island but was repulsed after suffering 1 man killed and 4 wounded. On 11 March, Coen ordered an all-out offensive. He divided his forces into several groups, which attacked different points on the island. The Dutch swiftly captured key strongholds, and by the end of the day the island's northern lowlands and southern promontories. The defenders and local populace fled to the hills that made up the island's center, with the Dutch forces in hot pursuit. By the end of 12 March, the Dutch occupied the whole island, suffering 6 killed and 27 wounded. With our foundation established, it's time to explore temporary peace and its relevance to our overarching theme. After the Dutch initial success, Lonta's upper class, the Orang Kaya, sought peace. They offered gifts to Coen and accepted all of the Dutch demands. They agreed to surrender their weapons, destroy their fortifications, and release any hostages they had captured. They accepted the Volk's sovereignty and the construction of several Dutch fortresses on the island, promised to pay a portion of their spice harvest, and sell the remainder exclusively to the Dutch at a fixed price. In exchange, the Dutch agreed to give the natives personal freedom, autonomy, and the right to keep practicing Islam. In the next segment, we'll be exploring resumption of hostilities and massacre and its implications for our subject matter. As peace was agreed between the Orang Kaya and the Dutch, most of the islanders fled to the hills and began to engage in skirmishes with the Dutch. Coen responded by razing villages and forcing their inhabitants to work for the Dutch. On 21 April, by means of torture, the Dutch extracted confessions from the Orang Kaya about a conspiracy against them. Coen captured at least 789 Orang Kaya along with their family members and deported them to Batavia, where many were enslaved. Having been accused of breaking the treaty and conspiring against the Dutch, 24 Orang Kaya were sentenced to death and decapitated by Japanese mercenaries on 8 May. The executions did not quell native resistance, however, so Coen ordered his troops to sweep the island and to destroy its villages in order to force the surrender of the population. The next few months the Dutch and the natives were engaged in fierce fighting. Witnessing the destruction caused by the Dutch, many natives chose to die of starvation or from jumping off the cliffs rather than surrender. Get ready to uncover the mysteries surrounding Aftermath as we navigate its intriguing terrain. According to Coen, about 2,500 inhabitants died of hunger and misery or by the sword. A good party of women and children were taken, and not more than 300 escaped. Hans Strube concluded that the Lonta's population would have been around people, 50 to 100 of whom died during the fighting, 1,700 of whom were enslaved and 2,500 of whom died due to famine and disease, while an unknown number of natives jumped to their deaths from the cliffs. Several hundreds escaped to nearby islands such as the Key Islands and Eastern Seram, their regional trading partners that welcomed the survivors. After the campaign, the Dutch controlled virtually all of the Banda Islands. The English had already abandoned Run and had an only intermittent presence on Nalika. By signing the 1667 Treaty of Breda, the English formally relinquished their claim to the islands. The islands were severely depopulated as a result of the campaign. American historians Vincent Loth and Charles Corn estimated that the entire population of the Banda Islands before the conquest had been around 15,000 people, of whom only 1,000 survived the conquest, including those who lived in or fled to the English-controlled islands of Eye and Run. Peter Leip estimated that 90% of the population was killed, enslaved or deported during the conquest. To keep the archipelago productive, the Dutch repopulate the islands, mostly with slaves taken from the Dutch East Indies, India and China, working under command of Dutch planters Perkiniers. The original natives were also enslaved and were ordered to teach the new arrivals about nutmeg and mace production. The treatment of the slaves was severe. Native bands' population dropped to 100 by 1681, and 200 slaves were imported annually to keep the slave population at a total of 4,000. Although the Dutch did not regard the Christianization of their slaves as a priority, they forced all Europeans on the Banda Islands to convert and adhere to the Dutch Reformed Church, a form of Calvinist Christianity, while Catholicism introduced by Portuguese Jesuits in the 16th century was forbidden and all Catholics forcibly converted. The slave population, consisting of surviving natives and imported slaves, was allowed to practice Islam or animistic faiths, but also encouraged and sometimes forcibly coerced to join the Reformed Church. I love interacting with my viewers, so leave me a comment and I'll do my best to respond.